Water changes. Water changes, water changes, water changes. Necessary or not. It's a matter of opinion, I suppose. Some people would say that no reef will survive without doing water changes. Other reefers would go and say, be willing to bet that you could survive and thrive years and years without attempting to do a water change. Depending on how much you have in your tank, depending on how heavily stocked you are. In this episode, I'll give you my take on whether water changes are necessary or not. And you can decipher and make your own decision to see whether you feel like they are necessary or maybe they're not. First, let's start with weekly. If you are choosing to do water changes, I guess you could make a argument of what your regimen should be, whether it's weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, bi-weekly. My take is if you do it weekly, what you're required to do is much less. So if I were to do a water change weekly on a nano tank, which is the one that you're looking at, which is a 30-gallon tank, if you're thinking about doing that, I would say 30 gallons if you're doing weekly water changes, maybe 5 to 10 gallons, 5 gallons weekly, which brings it up to, on a 30 gallon, that's far more than enough. Really, if you're doing weekly water changes on a 30 gallon, probably 2.5 gallons would probably be enough. That brings you to 30 gallons for the month, which is what they say is suggested. Do a 10 to 20% water change, 30% water change per month. And if you were doing 10%, 10 gallons a month, that's 33% of the water volume. So weekly water changes, if you're going to do them, are probably the best way to go because you're doing it less and you're keeping more consistent parameters. Reasons to do water changes. First and foremost, I believe my thoughts are is to replenish our nutrients. It reduces the amount or possible need to dose. So if you're dosing, if you're doing weekly water changes, you're less likely to have to dose as much because you're physically replenishing the nutrients and the things in your water column that are necessary for your corals and fish to thrive. And this is for people that have had a tank running for 6 months or more. Your first 6 months, I would lean towards really not doing any water changes if you just have fish in the tank, which is probably the route that a new reefer should take. You really shouldn't jump into corals before 6 months. I know this is a game of attrition. It's a game of patience. You got to be patient. Nothing happens overnight in the reefing hobby. So you sit and relax and allow things to play out over time, and things will grow and get better as time goes on. But the first 6 months, you let your biological load gather and gain as much as you can. So your bacteria really start taking hold and grabbing hold after 2 to 3 months, from my experience. After that, it's cemented itself within the system. So you doing water changes after 4, 5, 6 months is not going to take away from the biological load in your tank. It's just going to replenish the nutrients that the biology needs to thrive in your tank. Therefore, again, going back to you're having to dose less. You're having to worry about your alkalinity less. You're having to worry about your nutrients less because you're removing that bad water from the water column. Is it a necessity? Absolutely not. I watch people If you pay attention to YouTube, Sanjay, that I watched, that Jake from Reef Builders went to go see. He went to go see him, and I believe he said he's gone 20 years really not doing a water change on one of his soft coral tanks. So therefore, it's proof that you don't need to do it. But it is a soft coral tank, which requires less stable parameters and less stable nutrients. You don't have to have such low phosphates and nitrates to where you're going to have to worry about your corals bleaching or having tissue loss. If you test your parameters or in tune with your reef, visual inspection really is the most important and most valuable. So you can look at your reef after so many years and see that something's not right. Therefore, you can do a water change, or you can hold back and do water changes on a regular basis. Back to what I was saying, you can either do it weekly or monthly. Monthly is stretching it out, which is okay. That's good too, if that's what you're, as long as you stay on a regular routine. If your parameters aren't going up and down, then monthly water changes are perfect. You don't have to worry about it. If your nitrates and phosphates aren't rising, your alkalinity is not dropping to a level that's uncomfortable for your corals, then you're okay. That makes it all right. You can sit back and relax and enjoy your reef without having to worry about the water quality. Livestock can also determine whether you need water changes or the amount of water change needed. If you have very few corals and very few fish in a tank, then your nutrient levels are not going to be elevated to a point to where you're going to necessarily need to do a water change. Therefore, you could do less or maybe eliminate it completely if you're staying on top of the filtration in your tank. If you're cleaning your filters, if you're cleaning your protein skimmer, if you have UV, if there's different things that can eliminate the fact that you have to do a water change. But again, it goes back to preference, I believe, and in certain scenarios, preference is thrown out the window. If you have a tank that's overstocked with corals or fish, then I believe it's 100% necessary to do a water change, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly. I don't think anybody would disagree with the fact that if you have 20 fish in a 90-gallon tank or a 120-gallon tank, you're going to have to do water changes because your filtration is not going to be able to keep up with the nutrient levels that are being put in your tank if you're feeding the fish the way that they really need to be fed. I got two tanks. I got a coral tank here, which is my nano tank, and I have a 90-gallon fish-only tank. I'll tell you, I've done a water change on my fish-only tank. I do every other month. On the 90-gallon, I do 25 gallons every other month. My nutrients, you know, they go up and down, but I'm less worried about it because the fish don't need as stable of an environment as my corals do. As long as ammonia and nitrate doesn't get out of outrageous, and even nitrate's okay. As long as ammonia levels aren't elevated, your fish probably won't be affected. Other than that, this tank is my nano tank, which is going to be changed over into a 60-gallon cube tank. This nano tank I do water changes on once a week. I do once a week. I do personally, it's a 30-gallon tank. I do water changes, and I personally do 10 gallons once a week. And I think that things are looking good and thriving, and everything seems to be happy. The most success I've had is doing water changes. At the beginning, I've been reefing for 5 years. The first 2 years, I wasn't really in tune or on a steady calendar of doing water changes. I didn't stay with the same routine, and it showed. My corals weren't healthy and happy. I lost a couple fish here and there, and I don't think the fish was due to my water changes. That was just my lack of experience as a reefer. And you gain that over time. You get knowledge just through watching videos and paying attention to people. I feed twice a day in this tank. I keep the fish fed, as you can see. My clowns are fat and happy. My little wrasses, my little wrasse and my chromies. These guys will be moving into a 60-gallon cube tank soon. The tank's getting a little bit too small for them, and I don't feel comfortable keeping them in this tank. But I do feed these guys heavy, and I feed my corals at least twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week, and maybe even more than that sometimes. I clean my protein skimmer once a week. I take out, because this is an all-in-one tank, I take out the filtration in the back, and I have a UV sterilizer in the back, within the baffle in the back, a small turbo twist, and everything seems to be doing well and happy. So my suggestion personally with water changes is once a month at the very least. If you don't feel it necessary to do a water change, or as often as possible, or even, as often as you can. And if you get into a rhythm or routine, it's all really about preference and your bio load in the tank. If you don't have much, and if you're not looking to grow corals, then you could go as long as you want, as long as your parameters are safe for your fish. That's the main goal and objective, is to keep your animals and your fish healthy and happy, and make them live as long as possible. That is the goal, and that's how I would say it. So water change, water change, water change. That's what I was taught to do from the beginning. My mentor is a local guy that I go buy corals from on a regular basis. He's the one that I go to for answers when I need questions answered. When I first started this, he said your stability is the most effective and most common way to have success within this hobby. So I figured, how can I make myself as successful as possible, as easy as possible? I could dose, but that means that I have to test, or I have to have a monitor testing my system in order to keep my parameters at a level that would stay within what I desire. With that being said, the easiest way for me, I think, to do that without having to dose, I do dose periodically if I test my tank and the alkalinity's down, which it is periodic sometimes. I'll add alkalinity to the tank, or if my phosphates are high, I'll add some media in the back of the tank to lower my phosphates. And those are the two real parameters that I worry about, or I think about when dealing with my tank. Alkalinity and phosphates. My pH stays great because of where we live, upstate New York. I keep my pH at around 8.3, 8.4, and it doesn't really seem to leave that level. So I'm thankful for that. I guess the fresh air in New York State just keeps us, upstate New York, by the way. I'm not in New York City, but water changes are very important, and if you choose to do them, I would be willing to bet after 1 year, if you're a new reefer and you stick with doing water changes at the very least every other week. If you do a 5 to 10% water change every other week, I genuinely believe that you will be successful, and it will keep you in the hobby longer than you would have been had you laid back and just let everything go in your tank. Therefore, water change, water change, water change. That's my take on the situation. Hopefully you learned something from this, and hopefully you can take something out of it that will help you become a better reefer. I hope you have a happy Easter. Happy reefing.